I'm Kathleen Duble, and you may be wondering why I'm standing in a graveyard in 2 feet of snow. But it was actually right here that I began my search for the story of my grandmother 9 generations back, and began the journey to write her story and the story of many others who lived in the past. So how did this whole thing start? A few years ago, my father decided to do some genealogical research on my family. I had grown up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and had some family members living in the Midwest. At the time my dad decided to look into our past, I was living in this house in Andover, Massachusetts. And it wasn't too long into my dad's digging that he called me and he said, "Hey, guess what? You have ancestors who lived in Andover in 1692. Now that was a pretty weird thing to hear, because as far as we knew, we were Midwesterners. Obviously, we were curious. So my dad flew up to Massachusetts, and together we began to do more research. Here at the Historical Society in Andover, we discovered that my great-grandmother, Abigail Faulkner, was accused of witchcraft in 1692 and sent to the Salem town prison. And here's the amazing part. She was only 10 years old. We were shocked but excited. After my dad left, I began to do research myself and found out that more people were accused of witchcraft in Andover than in Salem itself. And a lot of young kids were accused of being witches, too. But the story got even stranger as I continued my research. I also found out that my great-grandmother's grandfather, who would have been my grandfather 11 times back, was a minister of Andover and North Andover at the time. Now, ministers back then weren't always paid in cash. Often they were given land because land was plentiful and cheap. And it turns out this house I was living in, it was on land that my great-grandfather had owned. Now, how spooky is that? So that's the story of how I got started writing historical fiction. And here's the book that I finally got published about my great-grandmother. It's called The Sacrifice. Since then, I've written many books of historical fiction. When at my husband's place in the Berkshires, I discovered the story of an old iron-producing town that actually made the anchor on the USS Constitution that's currently in Boston. So I wrote a love story based on that community called Hearts of Iron. I've done a story about Henry Hudson and his last and fateful voyage, and about his son, who was 17 at the time and doomed on that voyage too. It's a story of swashbuckling and spying and lots of adventure. I met a man who was a skiing soldier during World War II, and I wrote about the dangerous exploits of these men and about some of the battles they fought